Hey everybody, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to episode 3 of this History Book Club series. We have been reading a book by Jerry Oppenheimer, New York Times bestselling author, called Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream. This was published by St. Martin's Press in, I think, 2015. And in episodes 1 and 2 of the series, we got up to chapter 4. So today we're going to try and get through chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Fortunately, they're short chapters, and I'm not reading the whole book. I'm just sort of pulling some selected excerpts here for you. But Jerry Oppenheimer actually wrote a scathing, and I mean scathing, biography of Bobby's mother, Ethel Kennedy, who just passed away last October at age 96. That book is called The Other Mrs. Kennedy. It was published in 1994 and is quite rare today. If you find a copy on the internet at a bookseller, it's going to cost you. But it's nice to know that there are some versions you can listen to for free right here on YouTube. And I wanted to plug a couple of YouTube channels that are actually reading that book live in their book clubs right now. There's the Cheer Denise channel. She's currently reading The Other Mrs. Kennedy, and also Becky's Bookshelf. Becky just finished that book, and she's now doing another great book by David Pitts, all about the story of JFK and Lem Billings. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. plays a pretty prominent role in that story. We covered his early friendship with Lem Billings in our previous episode here, episode 2, in the last chapter of Jerry Oppenheimer's book. So I wanted to recommend those channels. Please do subscribe to Cheer Denise and Becky's Bookshelf. And I will put some links in the comments to their playlists for The Other Mrs. Kennedy and the book about Jack Kennedy and Lem Billings, which I highly recommend if you're interested in that fascinating relationship. So I'm going to stick with the RFK Jr. book. It's fascinating. I think there's a lot of interest in him right now because he's about to join the Trump administration that's taking power on January the 20th. Senate confirmation hearings are coming up. As you probably know, President Trump has nominated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be his new Secretary of Health and Human Services. Considering that is a huge federal agency with a lot of power, it's important for us to know who the real Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is. And I think that Jerry Oppenheimer does an admirable job here of painting an unvarnished, unflinching portrait of Kennedy. It is important to point out that Bobby Jr. did not cooperate with the writing of this book. He didn't grant Oppenheimer any interviews, probably because he'd read the book that Oppenheimer did about his mom. So he wanted no part of this book that Oppenheimer was doing on him. And of course he didn't, because he couldn't control it. Bobby Kennedy Jr. likes authorized biographies, like the one written by Dick Russell, or the Riverkeeper's book, or Waterkeeper's book that he did. Bobby does like to have control over his own image and how he's portrayed. I'm sure he would not agree with or like the way that he's portrayed in this book. But, you know, Oppenheimer cultivated so many sources over so many years deep within the workings of the Kennedy family, and especially the RFKs and Ethel and all of their children. So, and I think that these people have interesting stories to tell, the kinds of unauthorized, probably true stories, because they do corroborate one another, about the side of Bobby Kennedy Jr. that he doesn't like to talk about, but nonetheless exists. And some of these things are very troubling. It wouldn't surprise me to see him questioned about some of this behavior by the Senate in his confirmation hearings. So let's dive back into this book. We're going to start with Chapter 5, Practically Naked. The year is 1968. In the previous chapter, of course, we talked about the tragic assassination of his father in June of that year, and how that affected Bobby, his mother, and his siblings. And we were talking about his time at a school called Milbrook. That's where we're going to dive back in today with Chapter 5. Milbrook's teaching staff had been advised at a special faculty meeting called by the headmaster that Bobby Kennedy Jr. was coming to town, and we were gently told how not to behave with respect to him, remembered Peter Cole, who taught English. Cole got to know Bobby better when the boy joined the Milbrook ski team, which Cole coached. We were instructed not to go blabbing around to everybody that, oh, we have Bobby Kennedy Jr. on our campus. Be discreet was the message. And we learned at that meeting that Lem Billings would often be seen on campus with Bobby. But there was a leak, and the press had gotten wind of Bobby's isolated new school in the woods and hills on the edge of the town of Milbrook. They identified it, and pretty soon the school's mailroom was being deluged with letters and gifts for the slain presidential hopeful's namesake. Soon, groupies had begun sneaking onto campus in hopes of meeting and romancing a Kennedy scion. He would receive boxes and just piles of mail from people he never even knew, recalled his classmate, Brian Carroll, and all of these ridiculous teenage girls started to show up. I thought it was really horrible, actually, because the guy was a total train wreck. Before classes formally began, and before Bobby actually arrived on campus, the headmaster also called a student meeting held in the school's white-steepled New England village green-style Flagler Memorial Chapel and announced that the son of the recently slain presidential hopeful would be joining them. He gave us a quick background thing just so people would kind of know that this was the son of RFK and he was to be treated just like any other classmate, recalled his class of 1972 member Tom Kellogg, who noted that no other student had ever received such a coming attraction. It wasn't that it was Bobby or his dad were famous, it's that this was an unusual circumstance, that this was a new student whose dad had just been killed. It wasn't viewed as, this is a celebrity kid. On his arrival at Milbrook, Bobby's first exposure to school tradition was an embarrassing one. He had to stand practically naked in his underwear, forced to participate in an odd custom known as heights and weights, in which he and the other boys had to strip down and pass through a gauntlet of male teachers in the athletic department. The first actual physical contact, as it were, that I had with Bobby Kennedy was the first day of school when all of us faculty were assigned to check the new boy's vital statistics for the director of athletics, Fred Knudsen, a Latin teacher who was supposedly keeping track of the kids' growth or something like that, said James Hedgick, the new music teacher, who thought it all very strange. I just remember standing there and a bunch of boys in their underwear were passing in front of me, Bobby Kennedy being among them, a skinny little kid. I probably was reading too much into it, but it was soon after his dad's assassination and he looked kind of beat up. Lem Billings had a close friend at Milbrook, Jack Bauer, rumored to be gay or bisexual, who was an assistant headmaster and chairman of the English department, and who was excited to have young Bobby Kennedy as one of the incoming sophomores. Knowing Jack, he was impressed with the star power of the Kennedys, the glamour and the glitz of Camelot, observed Peter Cole, who taught under Mr. Bauer. Before becoming a teacher, Jack Bauer had worked for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and had often boasted to his students and faculty colleagues about his friendships in Hollywood with such glamorous stars as Elizabeth Taylor. But during his 14 years at Milbrook, there had been suspicions and rumors that Jack Bauer, who died in 2002 of a stroke at age 77, had gone beyond acceptable teacher-student behavior. While Bobby would play football for one season, he didn't make Milbrook's varsity squad, as Ethel had wished. Instead, he was a scrawny wide receiver on Milbrook's losing third-string team, known as Third Football, described by one classmate as, quote, undersized and generally decimated. He had two other interests, however. One was working in the school's Trevor Zoo. Milbrook actually had a genuine zoo as part of the school's required community service program, where he pursued the sport of falconry. His other interest was getting high, an extracurricular activity that would last for years, and one in which Lem Billings eventually actively participated. At Milbrook, Bobby had started playing a dangerous game with substance abuse, starting with marijuana and psychedelics, and his drug use would only grow worse. Drugs had become a major part of the scene at Milbrook, and Bobby would soon become a major player. As he acknowledged some years later, soon after my father's death, I made a series of choices involving drugs that started me down a road from which I had to struggle to return. It would not be a pleasant situation, especially in that late 60s era when, as Bob Dylan sang, the times, they are a-changin'. The headmaster's widow, who had remarried, gave this author an interview after the headmaster died in 1989. She clearly recalled all those years later that Bobby's matriculation at Milbrook caused much consternation for her husband, who had tried his best to deal with him. She said, "It was obviously a credit to the school and to us that the Kennedys chose Milbrook, and of course we wanted to do everything we could to help Bobby." She was in her late 70s at the time, looking back. "We were thrilled to be helping and participating," she said. "I had a feeling of great compassion and sadness that this child had to cope with this terrible tragedy." Bobby, she remembered, was very cute, small and thin and kind of wispy, not a strapping boy, and he just prompted feelings of needing care, although he remained very arm's length with people who tried to approach him. I know George, her late husband, could never get him to talk about his experience with his father. I don't think Bobby knew how. So part of it was really almost, how do we handle this and do it right? We didn't want to mess up, so there was a lot of that too. Our concern about being tactful. I don't know if my husband was walking a tightrope, but the situation with Bobby was very delicate. At the same time, there were so many shifts going on in the culture in those days, and marijuana had come to the campus. How do you deal with this? We had never even heard of marijuana before, she continued. Then the boys started growing their hair long, and what do you do about that? It was all very puzzling and confusing. George had to make some very unpopular decisions. Those decisions included establishing stern restrictions on student life, no cigarette smoking, which was not obeyed, mandatory haircuts, also not obeyed, and the most major, ejecting boys caught or even suspected of dealing or using drugs, which would eventually result in Bobby's downfall at Milbrook. As Bobby's classmate Mark Bonteque recalled, drugs were the flavor of the month, and the masters, some of them left over from my father's day at Milbrook, hadn't a clue. Drugs were pretty readily available. There was a lot of pot, psychedelics like LSD, and there might have been cocaine. All of them and more would be smoked, snorted, ingested, and injected by Bobby, his classmates asserted. Since most, if not all, of the Milbrook teaching staff had no experience with marijuana, the headmaster had come up with a curious way for them to identify its odor and apprehend the miscreant toker. At a faculty meeting, the headmaster passed around what he called awareness wafers. It was during Bobby's first year and my first year at Milbrook, and we were given these things by the headmaster and told to smell them, which was supposed to give us an acquaintance then with the smell of marijuana, should we ever encounter it in the dorms, and so at least we'd know what marijuana smelled like, said James Hedgick, the music teacher. They looked like large communion wafers, and they had the aroma of marijuana. Evidently, I was a conservative, straight guy, so even as a musician at Indiana, I simply wasn't involved in drugs. I didn't even smoke, for God's sake. That whole drug culture thing was new to me. I was just like clueless. The headmaster believed that Bobby should be put together with a proper first roommate, someone who hopefully would look out for him and make sure he didn't get into trouble. The New York City boy, Mark Giattani, was chosen. He came to Milbrook from the exclusive and private all-boys Allen Stevenson School, founded in 1883, located on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a school that required him to wear a preppy uniform of blue blazers and gray flannel pants. Notable alumni had included Michael Douglas, Michael Eisner, Peter Benchley, and James MacArthur, who played Dano Williams on TV's Hawaii Five-0. I graduated and was bound for Milbrook. Sometime over the summer, I got a letter from the headmaster who said that given what had happened, they thought I was the best candidate for being Bobby's roommate. And this was literally weeks after the assassination and the world was falling apart, recalled Mr. Giattini, who, like Bobby, came in as a sophomore, known as the fourth form. Mark was pretty carefully selected because he was absolutely straight, upfront, and smart, Peter Cole observed. Obviously, the headmaster didn't want to throw Bobby in with just anybody. Mark was a very streetwise New York kid, but very well-mannered, very mature, very smooth and polished. Was viewed as a big brother type for Bobby, and Bobby, who was somewhat withdrawn, needed that desperately. His dad was dead. He didn't seem to have a relationship with his brothers and sisters. His mother, who might have been on campus once in her life, was never around. You could see it in his clothes and in his posture and in his personal grooming habits, Cole noted, looking back to that time. He was a rumpled, skinny kid who always gave me the impression that his teeth needed brushing. His hair was a mess. His clothes were generally in need of a bath, and so was he. I can picture him with his black tie undone at the throat and half of his shirt tail in and half out. That was how he looked 90% of his waking hours. This was a pretty lonely kid with a family who, I guessed at the time, were just kind of shoving him aside. I saw Bobby as lost. The black tie, part of Bobby's bedraggled signature look at Milbrook, was the same one he had worn 3 months before at his father's funeral. He would wear it in his father's memory every school day, in every class, in the cafeteria, everywhere. Even when it became stained with food, he never had it cleaned. Besides the tie, the small room, 2 small desks, a bunk bed, bookshelves, that he shared with Giattani on the second floor in what was known as the dining hall dorm, had become a veritable shrine to Bobby's father. The walls were covered with black sheets, with framed photographs of his dead father attached to them. Small lights and possibly candles, which were generally banned for safety reasons, lit the space. We had a very interesting year together, Giattani recalled. Bobby was a birder and a falconer, and he had this great animal interest. I would go to sleep, and sitting about a foot away from me on a desk chair was Bobby's hooded falcon. But Giattani lasted with Bobby only through the first academic year. As Peter Cole later observed, Mark had struck me as the ideal guy to be a big brother to Bobby, but it was just too big of a job for him. Obviously, Mark was not particularly impressed with the fact that he had a star next to him, and Mark was as grown up as Bobby was infantile, which may explain why they didn't get together as roommates after the first year. After Giattani, Bobby would have at least 2 other roommates, underscoring his chaotic time at Milbrook and his difficulty in getting along with most of his classmates. By his second academic year, Bobby had seemingly all but given up the shrine to his father, whom he never talked about to anyone during his matriculation. He was then rooming with another classmate, Jamie Fanning, one of several Milbrook boys with whom he had started getting high. Bobby's room in the sophomore West dorm now had just a few framed photos and a small bronze bust of his father that he kept on a bookshelf, virtually hidden high above the desk in their small room. On the walls, blacklight hippie posters had replaced the funeral black sheets. The small bust of RFK was believed to be a model of one of 2 that had been commissioned by Ethel Kennedy in the wake of the assassination. And one of those busts sits in the Oval Office today behind President Biden at his desk. I believe that was a gift, actually, from Ethel Kennedy. Against the school's rules, Bobby also kept a sparrowhawk about the size of a pigeon, which flew around loose in the small dorm room. Bob always seemed dirty, like personal cleanliness dirty. He was sort of always grungy, a terrible mess, and he was almost proud of it, said Fanning, having never forgotten their time together. The room was filthy, and Bob let the bird, which perched on the bust of his father, shit all over the place, including all down the bust of his dead father. I thought, anything goes with this guy. Bobby was Machiavellian. He was kind of sinister. You didn't want to get too close to him. Chapter 6. Rumpled Kid. In Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s co-authored authorized book, The River Keepers, he told the story of how he and an environmentalist colleague, John Cronin, had battled the powerful corporate and governmental polluters in order to clean up the Hudson River. Rarely autobiographical in his various public writings over the years, Bobby included an atypical chapter about his claimed happy childhood, about his early interest in insects and animals, about his mother's family, the Skakels, and he painted a glowing picture of his boarding time school at Milbrook. His selective memory, however, was far different from the reality. Written off and glossed over in just 5 paragraphs in the book's 304 pages was his abbreviated, very troubled and turbulent matriculation. There was nothing about his often bizarre behavior or his drug use and other misdeeds. He left readers with the false impression that he went from Milbrook and, as he wrote, quote, followed my father's path through Harvard and the University of Virginia Law School. The fact is, Bobby did not graduate from Milbrook in 1972 or any other year. He actually was expelled and was forced to go to 2 other boarding schools where he was considered a problem student before he was finally able to get a high school diploma. In The River Keepers, he mentions nothing about the fact that his mother wanted to be rid of him following his father's assassination, and he made only one brief mention of the role that Lem Billings played in his life at the time. However, he wrote that Milbrook's chief attractions for him were the school's zoo and its natural history and ornithology programs, and he mentioned that he had joined the informal falconry program. Bobby painted an idealized portrait of his life at Milbrook and his pursuit of his falconry hobby. He made his time at Milbrook sound so pastoral and humane, but those who knew him well back then, such as Richard Bob Beauregard Jr., a veteran falconer and expert on birds of prey, saw an entirely different persona. Beauregard, who was a couple of years ahead of Bobby at Milbrook, was one of a small group who spent much time at the school's Trevor Zoo as part of the school's required community service. For Beauregard, who loved the outdoors and always wanted to be a scientist, that involved caring for a barred owl, a chinchilla, and a skunk, and later Empress, a golden eagle, then the zoo's premier animal. The way that Bobby later described his falcon and birding interest in his book was not the way Beauregard, who later went on to teach ornithology at the University of North Carolina, remembered. To Beauregard, who was one of the leaders of the falconry group at Milbrook, Bobby's pursuit of the sport was more like a scene out of a horror movie. Myself and a couple of others had our hawks, and we'd go out in the countryside hunting rabbits and squirrels, Beauregard said, looking back years later. But one of the reasons why I didn't spend much time with Bobby was his idea of falconry. Next to the school, there was a cow pit where the local dairy farmers threw their dead cows, and it was full of rats. Bobby would take his hawk and go hunting rats in the midst of all these rotting cow carcasses, and he sort of reveled in how off the wall that was. It was disgusting, and it wasn't my idea of having a good, healthy time with my hawks, so I let him do his falconry in the dead cow pit, and I went and chased rabbits in the woods, continued Beauregard, still revolted years later by the memory. It's pretty sick hunting rats in the midst of rotting cow carcasses. It was a turn-off, and it was gross. Bobby and I were together at the zoo flying hawks, but I really didn't want to interact with him. There wasn't great chemistry. He was wild. That was obvious. Another classmate of Bobby's and a falconer, Sumner Pingree III, was aware of what he termed, quote, Bobby's rat scene up at Bel Air Farm. And like Beauregard, he thought it was sickening. It was contrary to the situation that we otherwise engaged in with our birds, which was simply walking in the woods and catching squirrels and occasional rabbits and so forth. What Bobby was doing wasn't the bird hunting in its natural habitat, per se. Jamie Fanning, son of a conservative Republican thoroughbred horse trainer who didn't think much of the Kennedys, roomed with Bobby his last academic year at Milbrook and did a variety of drugs with him. Fanning had accompanied Bobby to the fetid, foul-smelling pit located on Bel Air Farm, dubbed Smell Air by the Milbrook faculty and students because of the revolting odors that occasionally wafted over to the school. Fanning, a self-described wild child at the time, recalled Bobby's visits to the pit, which he had witnessed, as grotesque. I still, to this day, see him standing there in his black necktie that he wore every day over a blue Oxford Brooks Brothers shirt and a beat-up tweed jacket, and wearing the wildest bell-bottoms that were purple with day-glow green stripes, like he was some soul band guy, and in his funky boots. And there he was, hunting rats out of that pile of dead sheep and cow carcasses. Bobby, he said, was an edgy guy. I know he had all that baggage with his father, but being in that pit, that was the kind of thing he would do. He almost did things to shock you on purpose. He was such an edgy kid that thing, as bizarre as it was to be over there hunting these rats out of this pile of dead carcasses, was almost normal for him. It was a pretty dark, grim time. He was miserable and he was angry. It only got worse with drugs. Many years later, Wayne Hall, a journalist friend of Bobby's, heard about the rat pit story and said, "That's kind of a template for Bobby's life. Here he is, a rich kid who could just go out with the rest of the falconers and do the normal thing, but Bobby's a rebel, and instead he's out there in the middle of the rats trying to knock off bad things." One of Bobby's Milbrook classmates was Ned Rumanier, whose father had a long and storied history with the Kennedy family. Jimmy Rumanier, was John F. Kennedy's roommate at Harvard, and as such was much a Kennedy insider as Lem Billings. Only Rumanier was heterosexual. His son Ned was one out of 8 children, 7 boys and a girl. And the senior Rumanier thought very little of Lem Billings, whom he considered just a clown who never really matured. As for his close pal, Kennedy, he was a fun-loving, girl-crazed fool, he said of JFK. Ned Rumanier became a psychotherapist and had a take on what he termed Bobby's, quote, morbid interest, enjoying watching his hawk go after rats. Noting that Bobby's pursuit was during the hippie time when love was in the air, 1968, 69, his displaying a morbid interest in seeing a hawk go after rats was countercultural. Further, he suspected that Bobby had such a morbid interest long before his father died, and that the cowpit bizarreness was unrelated, as one might have assumed, to a twisted emotional response to the assassination. As Rumanier later observed, Bobby was a kid, from my understanding, who was pretty unregulated, pretty unsupervised. There are a lot of kids who do that kind of thing whose dads are alive who don't go through a tragedy. There was a major side benefit of being a member of what some called the rogue falconry group. They were permitted to wander around in the woods without teacher supervision, which allowed those like Bobby to light up a doobie and not get caught. As Pingree, who acknowledged smoking the occasional joint, noted, anybody else wandering around in the woods was immediately suspect. But we were walking around in the woods with these birds, and even the birds sometimes were high, literally and figuratively. At one point, Bobby, possibly stoned, lost one of the birds in his care, and a massive search was started. As a member of the falconry group pointed out decades later, if you were conscientious and you were thoughtful and you took the rules of the road seriously, the chances of losing a bird were relatively minimal. But Bobby was reckless. When some injuries were discovered at the school's Trevor Zoo, Bobby came under suspicion, despite the fact that he was known to love the wildlife in his care. It kind of followed him around, said the music teacher, James Hedgick, there were some injuries to some of the animals, to some of the birds, and some people had fingered Bobby on that perhaps he had a hand in actually abusing animals. Everything in those days got to the headmaster because it was such a small community. I don't think anything ever came of it. I'm going to stop right here because when this book was published, 10 years ago, we didn't know what we know now about RFK Jr. You might hear these stories about hunting rats in, cow carcasses and how Bobby was enjoying it. You might dismiss that as just kind of, a teenage phase, wild drug-induced antics, something that he was going through, but he got over it. He didn't, as we now know. During his presidential campaign of 2024, stories emerged that we'd never heard before. It shows that he still apparently has a strange fascination with collecting the carcasses of dead animals.
A decade ago, a Central Park mystery baffled New Yorkers.
We saw something on the back wheel that it could have been a raccoon.
And captured headlines across the country.
Police now want to know how the bear died and how it got into the park.
Now we know. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the independent presidential candidate, says he brought the dead bear to Central Park.
I pulled over and I picked up the bear and put him in the back of my van because I was going to skin the bear.
He confesses in a new video that he left the dead bear right there with an old bicycle beside a Central Park bike path because he thought it would be, quote, amusing. In the videotaped confession, Kennedy recounts the strange tale to controversial comedian Roseanne Barr and says he is talking about it now because a fact checker for The New Yorker told him that the magazine plans to publish an article that details Kennedy's role in bringing the dead bear to Central Park. Anyway, Kennedy recounts how he saw a woman hit the bear with her car on a highway in upstate New York. He says he picked up the dead cub, intending to skin it and store the flesh in his refrigerator. But after a day of falcon hunting, he had to rush to a dinner at Peter Luger's Steakhouse in Brooklyn, where steak for two these days costs about $150. And then he had to go to the airport.
I wasn't drinking, of course, but people were drinking with me who thought this was a good idea. I said, let's go put the bear in Central Park and we'll make it look like he got hit by a bike.
In the new video, he says he was shocked to discover how much attention the discovery of the dead bear with the bicycle got the next day.
I was worried because my friends were all over that bike.
It's not the only bizarre story to come out during the Kennedy campaign. Earlier this year, it was revealed that he once testified that a worm, quote, got into my brain and ate a portion of it and then died. That was back in 2012. At one point, Kennedy was in double digits in the polls.
Don't you want something different?
He's now dropped to about 6% in the 538 polling average. But his campaign claims his name will be on the ballot in at least 42 states. That's not enough to win, but it could be enough to play a decisive role in determining who does.
Oh, but wait, there's more.
Another bizarre story involving former presidential candidate RFK Jr., and this one involves a whale, and now an environmental group wants answers. A whale of a tale has Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in hot water with environmentalists again, just weeks after he admitted to dumping a dead baby bear in Manhattan.
I said, let's go put the bear in Central Park and we'll make it look like he got hit by a bike.
Kennedy faces new backlash. The longtime conservationist allegedly sawed the head off a dead whale back in 1994 after it washed up on a Massachusetts beach. Kennedy reportedly cut off the whale's head and then bungee corded it to the roof of the family minivan before driving it across state lines to bring it back to his New York home so he could study the skull. RFK's daughter, Kit Kennedy, originally shared the fishy anecdote more than a decade ago, calling the stunt normal day-to-day stuff. But the story resurfaced in recent days, leading the Center for Biological Diversity Action Fund to call on federal officials to investigate whether Kennedy violated the Marine Mammal Protection Act, saying, "We hope that the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement, at a minimum, is able to ensure that Mr. Kennedy surrenders any and all illegally obtained wildlife that he continues to possess." The Action Fund has publicly supported Vice President Harris in the presidential race. Kennedy recently suspended his campaign, endorsing former President Trump, and now has secured a position on Trump's team.
I've been asked to go onto the transition team and, to help pick the people who will be running the government.
Kennedy has not commented on the whale story.
Okay, so after that strange interlude, let's get back into the book. Not long after Bobby arrived at Milbrook, he brought with him his newest pet, a lion cub named Toto, to be housed and cared for in the Trevor Zoo. But Toto's Milbrook stay, like his owner's, didn't last as long as had been expected, especially after the fast-growing little fellow growled, then attacked and took a bite out of the backside of the newly appointed science department chairman and zookeeper, Seward Trainer Hiley. Toto's playful attack on Mr. Hiley, luckily the bite wasn't major, was not unexpected as he grew older and bigger by the day. When Toto was just a little kitten, we'd go out in the fields and take him chipmunk hunting on occasion, but he never caught any chipmunks. As he got bigger, he became more difficult, Peter Cole recalled. If you walked into the zoo, Toto would charge down the lane and land on your chest, and you'd end up on your back with a big tongue in your face. Toto was thought to have had a famous pedigree of sorts. He was first believed to have been one of the 3 cubs from a litter born to Elsa, the lioness star of the 1966 British drama Born Free. The popular film was based on the true story of Joy and George Adamson, a game warden who had raised Elsa, an orphan cub, to adulthood, eventually releasing her into the Kenyan wild. The playful and powerful 10-week-old Toto, still unweaned, had been a gift to Bobby from the close Kennedy family friend, Jack Paar, a popular late-night TV talk show host and original host of The Tonight Show, incidentally, who had brought Toto and 2 other cubs back from Africa the previous summer. Jack Paar, who was fascinated by lions, also gave one to his daughter, Randy, a student at Radcliffe College, and he kept the 3rd in his suburban New York City home in preparation for an hour-long fall 1969 TV special, Jack Paar and His Lions. When he procured these 3 cubs, he had the mistaken impression that they were from the famed Elsa's brood, an error that he acknowledged on his TV show. Along with Lem Billings, Jack Paar was one of Bobby's most frequent adult visitors at Milbrook, showing concern for the boy's well-being and also looking in to see how Toto was doing. A liberal Democrat who supported both Jack and RFK's presidential runs, Jack Paar also had close social ties to the Kennedys. Paar, his wife Miriam, and Randy often were dinner guests of RFK and Ethel, and Jack Paar would lecture his daughter on her table manners before arriving at Hickory Hill. At the table, she once turned to RFK when he was running the Justice Department and said, "Mr. Attorney General, would you like one of my shrimp?" It was a story Jack Paar liked to tell. Parr's allegiance to the Kennedys was generously reciprocated in March of 1964, 4 months after JFK's assassination, when RFK was a guest on Parr's popular program, his first public appearance since the tragedy in Dallas. This heavily promoted exclusive interview got huge ratings for Jack Paar and mesmerized viewers across the country still traumatized by the assassination. RFK, appearing at peace after mourning his brother, garnered a few laughs and much applause from the respectful studio audience. He revealed that his just-widowed sister-in-law, Jackie, was doing fine, making an adjustment and doing it well, that his brother Ted and family friend Dave Powers were spending time with little John Jr. and his sister Caroline so they could see some men in their saddened lives. And he declared that his late brother's major achievement as president was, in part, making Americans feel young again. Meanwhile, at Milbrook, Bobby was viewed by some fellow students as egotistical and irresponsible for strutting around the campus and on the sidelines at home football games with a potentially dangerous young lion on a leash. Rob Beauregard, one of the respected student leaders at the Trevor Zoo, recalls being particularly incensed at Bobby. He used to walk the lion, which was of reasonable size, through the zoo complex, and all of a sudden it saw a deer and decided it wanted to go after it and started dragging Bobby on the leash. Somehow he avoided it catching the deer. The way he was handling the lion was dumb, and it seemed a bit arrogant. When the lion started trying to catch and eat other animals in the zoo, the school decided that maybe it wasn't a good fit. By late 1968, the end of Bobby's first semester, it was decided by the headmaster and the still smarting zookeeper that 7-month-old Toto had become too big, weighing in at close to 130 pounds, and too dangerous. He had to go. His new home? Lion Country Safari in West Palm Beach, Florida. Randy Parr's cub and the one her father had been keeping at his home, he had named it Jack, had also been sent there. In January 1969, Jack Parr was filming his TV special on lions at Lion Country when Jack attacked him, knocked Jack Parr off his feet, and bit him on the right wrist, puncturing his skin. Several game wardens had to pull him off. Chapter 7. Breaking Bad. At 14 and 15, Bobby Kennedy Jr. at Milbrook School was proving his bad boy bona fides with Jesse Pinkman's zeal. While he didn't have a chemistry teacher like Walter White, a.k.a. Heisenberg of TV's Breaking Bad, the Camelot scion was doing everything he could to get high on whatever drugs he could get his hands on. On one occasion, when Bobby was visiting the dorm room of a classmate, Nick Forster, with whom he played on the school's third-string football team, Forster happened to spot a pill of unknown origin on the floor near the radiator. It wasn't his, he claimed years later, and he thought it might have belonged to his roommate or former occupant. It was a fairly healthy-sized pill with an omega symbol on it, he recalled, and I showed it to Bobby, and he's like, "Oh, great." He looked at it for a second, didn't know what it was, but popped it in his mouth and swallowed. Not that he was cavalier, but I think his goal was just to sort of get stoned at any cost, or to let me know that he was a little reckless. In my experience, he was interested in acting out for shock value. Bobby's pill popping, however, was no surprise to his roommate, Jamie Fanning. We'd have these conversations in our room at night, lying there before we'd fall asleep, Bobby on the top bunk, Fanning on the lower, and he told me that when you go to somebody's house, always ask to use the bathroom and check in their medicine cabinet because they always have good pills that you can steal. I thought, that's the kind of shit heavy drug users pull. But for this kid to say that to me at that time was pretty deep and dark. But that's the kind of kid he was, deep into bad stuff. I had smoked some pot for the first time with some older guys in June of my freshman year, before I knew Bobby. It was so new to me. I was president of my freshman class. I was kind of a leader, and then I went astray. But Bobby was like somebody who had been around all this stuff and experienced it at too early an age. I turned 16 that fall that he was my roommate, and he had all this shit going on in his life, and I thought, what the hell? We were just children, but he'd do anything to get high. Fanning had concluded much later that Bobby back then was getting deeper into drugs because, quote, he was really furious, really frustrated, and totally sad about his dad, but he didn't talk about it. He was alone. His mom never came. There was no sign of her. His Uncle Teddy came once in his limousine, and that was it. His only interests were falconry, getting stoned, and his involvement with, or acting as ringleader of, a summertime gang known as the Hyannisport Terrors, whose nefarious activities had started in the summer of 1967, a full year before his father's murder. Bobby said the Hyannisport terrors were the coolest thing ever, and he boasted about how they ran around and stole alcohol and did whatever they wanted to do, recalled Fanning. The HPTs, as they were known, consisted mainly of Bobby, his troubled younger brother David, who would later die of a drug overdose, and 2 cousins. They were Bobby Shriver, one of the 5 children of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the 5th of Rose Kennedy's brood of 9, and Christopher Kennedy Lawford, who also became ravaged by drugs prior to finally getting clean. He was one of the 4 children of the hard-drinking, drug-abusing, and philandering British actor Peter Lawford and Patricia Kennedy Lawford, also an alcoholic, the 6th of Rose Kennedy's children. Years later, Chris Lawford, after much therapy and drug rehab, diplomatically described the HPTs as our pathetic homage to gang activity. Our purpose was to do some mischief and make a public statement demonstrating our incorrigibility brought on by raging hormones and a surge in testosterone. Led by Bobby, their rampage that first summer was relatively innocent. They threw firecrackers at passing cars, untied docked boats, filled bags with dog feces, set them on fire, and left the messes on the porches of Hyannisport residents. Another stunt was a bit more serious, shoving a potato in the muffler of a police car, causing it to backfire. The local cops rounded up the offenders and showed up at RFK and Ethel Kennedy's house to report the incident. The gang members, expecting extreme punishment, instead heard a roar of laughter led by Uncle Bobby. Lawford recalled in his memoir, aptly entitled Symptoms of Withdrawal. By the summer of 1969, following Bobby's first troubled year at Milbrook, the HPT's sophomoric stunts grew darker and more frightening. Most, if not all of them, the brainchild of RFK's namesake, who, like some teenage terrorist, wore all black and often had a vicious-looking predatory falcon on his gloved hand. One of the strangest escapades carried out by the HPTs involved a sick play on the many past Kennedy tragedies, the most recent being the assassination of RFK just a year earlier. Young Bobby would order one of his cohorts to hit the fender of a passing car, and when the driver braked in a panic, another of the gang fell near the front wheels, pretending to be dead. That was the signal for Bobby to scream, "You've killed a Kennedy! You've killed a Kennedy!" As frightened pedestrians and motorists gathered, the HPT on the ground would jump up and jauntily walk away, with Bobby laughing maniacally. The motorist, who probably almost had a heart attack, and the shocked bystanders naturally were furious at the sick game. But Bobby's only response when someone advised him to stop upsetting and antagonizing the townspeople of Hyannisport was, "Fuck them." When a local policeman nabbed Bobby Shriver for one of their twisted exploits, Bobby Jr. arrogantly took charge of the situation. He confronted the cop, hiding his hawk inside his jacket. When the officer demanded to know what he was concealing, fearing a weapon of some sort, Bobby responded, "I have a hawk, and he's trained to kill cops." He then shoved its beak in the cop's face. Stunned, the officer jumped back, his hand on his Smith & Wesson, but luckily restrained himself, thus avoiding another real Kennedy tragedy by gunfire. Taking drugs was also part of the gang's life, which included smoking marijuana, ingesting the psychedelic drugs, LSD and mescaline, and popping amphetamines. At Milbrook, Bobby arrogantly bragged about his stunts. His chum, Jamie Fanning, listened and thought it all sounded so cool, but much later came to the conclusion, Bobby was self-destructive. I really think he was suicidal. He wasn't sure he wanted to be alive or not. He was pissed off at the world, but kept it bottled up. Bobby had read in the Village Voice, one of the country's first alternative weekly newspapers, which in the 1960s reported extensively on the beatnik and hippie scenes, that one could get high ingesting morning glory seeds, of all things. He immediately proposed the idea to Fanning, and they got their hands on some, soaked them in water overnight to get rid of the poison that was usually sprayed on them to kill rodents, and the next morning blithely swallowed them. I don't remember that we went on any great trips, recalled Fanning. We only felt really sick. Bobby came up with another idea that he proposed to Fanning and a few others as a way to get a rush, as he called it, hyperventilating, which was similar to autoerotic asphyxiation but without the sex. But Bobby's version could be just as dangerous, as Fanning would soon learn. Their classmate, Peter Kisting, who sacrificed his gerbils and hamsters as a lure to help Bobby's falcon come down from the trees, witnessed him hanging over the side of his bed with his head on the floor until all the blood rushed to his brain, and then he would quickly sit up. He told me he got the feeling of being high. Some of us thought it was funny, but apparently it worked for him. Remembering back to that time, Kisting believed that Bobby used drugs and boasted of his use of drugs as a way to ingratiate himself with some of the other students who were either wary of him and kept their distance or thought he was snobbish. I would say to Bobby, "Do you have any pot?" And he would say, "Yeah, but not much, because I have to divide it up for others." And he would give me something, Kisting said. He made little baggies, and he would be one to give it away, not sell it. However, other students, such as Tom Kellogg, who played soccer and ran track and didn't partake of drugs, viewed Bobby as haughty and superior. I didn't find him to be pleasant, he recalled. He ignored most of us. He wouldn't say hi or strike up a conversation. Their classmate, Brian Carroll, thought the same. You could look Bobby in the eye, and unless you were really, really close to him, you meant nothing to him. He would just look right through you. My impression as a kid was that he was a severely wounded young person. My lasting memory of Bobby is with a gray, broken or damaged tooth, dirty bell-bottoms, and a thick leather falconer's glove, ready to head for the woods. The music teacher, James Hedgick, had a problem back then characterizing Bobby as standoffish, but felt that he just didn't try to draw attention to himself. There wasn't any of that, "I'm Bobby Kennedy." I think it was the hangers-on that brought more attention to him, like Lem Billings, unwanted or wanted. At one point, Bobby was standing in a school line, ignoring everyone around him, when an upperclassman angrily confronted him about his aloofness, and in the course of the verbal attack, invoked the name of his father's assassin. Bobby's friend, Nick Forster, was standing nearby when it happened. I was horrified, he recalled. This guy was saying, "Fuck off, shape up, and stop being such a pussy. Do you think we're all Sirhan Sirhan?" But Bobby respected and was drawn to that kid as a result of that criticism. It was something like, okay, here's a guy who's holding me to task and sort of calling me on my bullshit and is not afraid to mention the unmentionable. Bobby seemed actually appreciative. With Fanning, Bobby's other method of getting turned on by hyperventilating required a bit of team effort. One was to breathe quickly and strenuously in and out and then hold his breath, while the second person squeezed his chest until he passed out. I did black out, said Fanning, but it wasn't like any kind of turn-on thing. It was more like, oh, cool, I fainted. But for Fanning, it was more serious. As he passed out, he hit and cut his head on the edge of the metal frame of the bunk bed in their dorm room. With a big, bloody, scary lump, Fanning had to be rushed by Bobby to the infirmary for emergency first aid. The nurse's office was the last place any of the boys wanted to go because the aged, silver-haired nurse in charge began any examination, whether it be for a sore throat or a stomachache, by having students drop their pants and cough while she held their testicles. The speculation was that she was either getting a thrill or, more likely, dissuading malingerers from coming into her office. When Bobby and Fanning arrived, his head bleeding, she demanded to know how it happened. "We were really good liars," said Fanning. Bobby convincingly explained that his roommate had slipped on their dorm room's newly waxed linoleum tile floor. No further questions were asked, no trousers were dropped, and Fanning was given first aid. With his HPT, Partners in Crime, Bobby had been doing mescaline, which sent him on a 10 to 12-hour trip. A component of the cactus peyote, mescaline is one of the world's oldest psychedelics. A girl from another prep school had sent some in the form of what resembled a big brown pill to Fanning with a warning: don't do it by yourself, share it with somebody. Knowing that Bobby was one of the few people at Milbrook who did psychedelics such as LSD and mescaline, Fanning showed it to him and asked if he wanted to try it. Bobby's enthusiastic response was, yeah, let's do it Saturday night. That Saturday afternoon, Fanning played football, an away game, on Milbrook's varsity team. When he got back to his room, rather than wait for Bobby, he split the pill in half and impatiently took it. Half an hour later, Fanning recalls, I wasn't feeling anything, so I ate the other half. Then Bobby shows up and says, you still got that mesk? I told him I didn't feel anything, so I ate the whole thing. He goes, you asshole. When the drug kicked in, Bobby was at his side to talk Fanning through his crazy first psychedelic experience. In the evening, Bobby escorted Fanning to the Saturday night weekly movie shown on campus. People told me to shut up because I was being inappropriately loud, acting like a fool. I was up all night, but Bobby did a good job in keeping me reined in and not letting me make a total fool of myself. I had a good trip, if you could call it such a thing. Psychedelic drugs were as readily available on the Milbrook school campus as candy bars in the school's milk bar. Since the mid-60s, the town of Milbrook, a weekend getaway for a number of wealthy New Yorkers, had been the world headquarters of the high priest of the psychedelic movement, Dr. Timothy Leary. Near the school was the former Harvard professor's rented estate, which he called the Castalia Institute, part of his League of Spiritual Discovery. Its acronym, LSD. Leary's legendary slogan was, turn on, tune in, drop out. President Nixon had called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. And the illustrious Milbrook graduate William F. Buckley, in a Times essay, had noted, Timothy Leary ran a kind of anti-Milbrook school for drug users. The headmaster of Milbrook had warned students to stay away from Leary's place or face expulsion. Along with the drugs, there was lots of free love on the grounds of Leary's Xanadu, attracting liberated young women and stoners of all sorts. Leary's place and the wild goings-on in the placid village caught the attention of the national news media. For example, a lengthy piece in the New York Times in a column entitled The Talk of Milbrook was headlined, Leary Drug Cult Stirs Milbrook. Uneasy Village Fears Influx of Addicts. Local authorities were keeping a close watch on Leary's operation, and school officials believed that one in particular, the former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy, assistant district attorney in Dutchess County, which encompassed Milbrook, was determined to nail him. When Bobby arrived at Milbrook School in 1968, Leary had just published a collection of his speeches, essays, and interviews entitled The Politics of Ecstasy. It was believed by a number of Milbrook School faculty members that the conservative, Kennedy-hating prosecutor might target Bobby along with Timothy Leary. On the faculty, we believed that G. Gordon had a hair up his ass for Bobby and was going to bust him, and that could have been something the headmaster brought up in a faculty meeting, recalled Peter Cole. A few of the members of the faculty that I was close to, and I considered that threat to be something fairly serious, our thought was, if you're a Republican politician and wanting to make a name for yourself, what better arrest could you make than a Kennedy? G. Gordon Liddy later gained infamy as one of President Nixon's secret operatives who oversaw the 1972 break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate office building, the beginning of Nixon's fall from power. While Bobby was never busted for drugs by law enforcement authorities while at Milbrook, that would happen later, for marijuana, and still later after that for heroin, but G. Gordon Liddy did orchestrate a raid on Timothy Leary's estate. In his 1996 autobiography, Will, Liddy noted that local boys and girls had been seen entering and leaving the estate. Fleeting glimpses were reported of persons strolling the grounds in the nude. To fears of drug-induced dementia were added pot-induced pregnancy. The word was that at Leary's lair, the panties were dropping as fast as the acid. I just want to add to that, more than 4 decades after Bobby left Milbrook, he still had it in for G. Gordon Liddy. In 2013, Bobby used to write a regular column for the Huffington Post. And in one of his blogs titled Obama and Nixon, A Historical Perspective, he called G. Gordon Liddy, get this, a murderous former Dutchess County, New York prosecutor and Adolf Hitler admirer. He also wrote that G. Gordon Liddy was part of a group that had allegedly once planned to murder the Nixon critic, the journalist Jack Anderson, syndicated columnist. Citing a biography of Jack Anderson, Bobby wrote that the means of death was to involve the use of a massive dose of LSD. Ironically, Bobby's own favorite psychedelic, along with mescaline, back in the day. So I think I'm going to stop reading there. We got through 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7 of Jerry Oppenheimer's book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream. And believe it or not, it gets even darker in the chapters ahead. So I hope that you'll tune in for the next episode, where we will go even deeper into his drug use, unfortunately, which followed in the early 70s. You know, Bobby was a heroin addict for, I think, 14 years of his life until he was kind of forced to get clean. And we'll tell you why that happened and how that happened in future episodes. So I hope you're enjoying this. Please do bookmark this playlist and subscribe to my channel. Be sure to click the notifications bell so you never miss a chapter, never miss an episode of this riveting book. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.